thinking about how some of my insights apply in the current COVID-19 landscape. If you have any questions for me throughout the talk, I'll leave some time at the end, but you can also ask them in the chat window. And if the questions are related to the point I'm making, I'll address them right away. If they're more substantive, I'll address them at the end. And I really look forward to having this conversation with all of you today. So thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to be sharing some of my work and research, looking at the interrelationships between time, money, and happiness. I am a happiness researcher by training. Most of my research focuses on how we can, or the factors that promote how people feel about their lives overall, so life satisfaction, as well as the amount of joy, stress, sadness that we experience on an everyday basis, and how time and money decisions shape those outcomes. So I want to start by asking everyone on the call today to put in the chat window what comes to mind when you think about the word time. So anything goes, what feelings and behaviors come to mind when you're thinking about the word time? Deadlines, fleeting, never enough. These are very common responses when I ask this question. And for everyone who's feeling like me right now, at the beginning of a busy academic semester, kind of stressed and overwhelmed by deadlines, you're not alone. So while there's a lot of things we can do with our time and a lot of things that we use our time for that are positive, like exercising, socializing with friends and family, visiting our favorite landmarks, and volunteering or spending time with our furry companions, when we ask people in large-scale surveys how they feel about time, over 80% of employed adults feel overwhelmed by the demands of work and life. So using data from the Gallup World Poll, we see that stress is on the rise worldwide, and that's driven in part by the demands on our time created by work. So in one large-scale data set, just looking at the US daily poll, we asked people how time stress they felt, to the extent to which they felt overwhelmed by the demands of work and life. 80% of working Americans reported feeling time poor, and this feeling had a stronger negative effect on happiness in our data than being underemployed. So these feelings of being overwhelmed by the demands of work and life are consequential for our happiness, our social relationships, even our physical health. And these feelings have increased as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to start by talking about a few of the factors, both organizationally and individually, that make us feel time poor. Then I'm going to spend the majority of my talk talking about strategies that we can all take to help ourselves and our teams take control over our time and live a happier life. So it's not our fault that we feel time poor. So again, stress is the dominant feeling that people think about when they think about time. Yet time poverty is often neglected or enhanced by governments, companies, and aid programs. So in a conceptual review paper that my two postdocs and I published in Nature of Human Behavior last year, we documented factors in the literature suggesting that paperwork costs $15 billion in lost wages per year, idle time, so being stuck in between tasks at work. Research suggests results in $100 billion of lost productivity in the US per year. And ordeal costs can undermine the efficacy of aid. We often think about helping people who are struggling to make ends meet by providing them with financial compensation. However, I see in my data that the aid often incurs time cost, and we can actually help those who are struggling to make ends meet by eliminating some of the ordeal costs that they face and frictions in their everyday life. Organizations would stand to benefit from trying to alleviate time poverty. So we see in our data that organizations, again, this was pre-pandemic, but so we've collected some more data suggesting time affluence is even more important for employees now than it was pre-pandemic, but that the provision of time-related benefits such as parental leave, flex time, sick days, and social experiences in a large job satisfaction survey had a similar benefit for employees' happiness as making $60,000 of extra salary. And we also know from the research literature that organizations lose 32 days each year to reduce productivity because of mental health concerns, which are often driven by stress and feeling overwhelmed by work and life demands. In the US in 2018, these lost productivity due to mental health concerns cost companies $44 billion. Very concretely, an employer with 1,000 employees might have 200 employees with depression, and 6,400 lost days of productivity per year. It's no wonder that 75% of workplaces say that stress is their #1 concern. As I've mentioned, these time demands have increased during COVID-19. My colleagues have suggested that work hours during March 2020, so during those initial lockdowns, increased by about 8.2% or 49 minutes globally. And we've also lost productive work time in part to digital distractions. So their data suggests that what was creating these long work hours were increased digital collaboration, so additional meetings and additional emails. And in some data that, again, two of my postdocs and I published in PNAS this last year, we found that in a large representative survey of working adults from 5 countries, that working women completed 12 more days of chores in 2020 and had 6 fewer days of active leisure, making the point that these time demands are not evenly distributed. So we're all feeling busier, and working mothers in particular are bearing the brunt of these additional time demands. So this is just kind of data showing from that initial paper that some of the additional work demands created by the hybrid and virtual work environments are being driven by virtual distraction. So we're sending more emails, we're having more meetings, and that happens to occur before and after the workday. And this is just a little bit more information about the data I mentioned, which shows that women who are working remotely worldwide are spending more time in chores and childcare. So we collected remote workers' responses from 44 states and 88 countries. In these data, we observed that remote workers felt less productive. So people felt like they had gained less productive time, or they had gained more unproductive time and felt less productive. And part of the reason we're feeling less productive now that we've been working virtually and in hybrid again is due to distraction. So those who are highly challenged by distractions are the ones who are saying that they've lost the most productive work time as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, these distractions are not just work and meeting related, they also have to do with chores and childcare. So people, especially, are saying that they've completing more chores and childcare as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. These are just the same results again, that women are in 2020 have completed 12 more days of chores and had 8 fewer days of active leisure like exercise and socializing, which we know are really important for happiness. So related to this digital distraction, even pre-COVID, one of the top three predictors of feelings of time poverty was this constant digital distraction. So not only does constant email communication pull us out of the present and remind us of all the other things we could or should be doing, and actually reduces the amount of time that we have each day, but digital distraction also undermines our enjoyment. So in this graph here, which I also have in my book, you can see kind of before constant digital distraction, we used to have a nice hour of time between 7 and 8 after work where we could work on whatever we wanted. Maybe we were cooking dinner, spending time with friends and family. And now that time is a lot more distracted. So this is the idea of time confetti, which makes us feel time poor. So now that same block is chunked up into smaller amounts of time that easily go missing or lost. And research suggests that this time confetti can make our leisure experiences less meaningful. So in one study that my colleagues conducted of working parents at a science museum, they asked parents to turn on the alerts on their phone or to, in one condition, and then another condition asked parents to turn off the alerts on their phone. Parents who had the alerts on their phone on while spending time with their kid in a science museum remembered less about the event, experienced less meaning, and felt significantly lonelier as a function of being constantly pulled away from what you were doing and trying to be present in the moment, to all being reminded of work and the opportunity cost of your leisure. So Nick was asking, is there any evidence that people are actually less productive, or it's just that they're feeling this way? So there is some economic data suggesting that during COVID-19, people are actually less productive. So my data as a social psychologist, I'm focused on people's perceptions of time. However, there's some economics data suggesting that remote workers are spending more time to get this to the same amount of output, suggesting that they're less productive now as opposed to pre-pandemic, in part because of these digital distractions and longer work days. So in the hopes of moving the conversation from identifying kind of these social or systematic barriers that can make us feel time poor, One thing that is helpful from an individual perspective as a social psychologist is to focus on the psychological factors that can make us feel time poor that we might have control over in our everyday lives. So the first step to becoming more time affluent, feeling like we have more control over our time, is to recognize and overcome what I like to call time traps. So the first time trap is driven by organizational factors, but it's this idea that it's most of us or many of us are focused on money or productivity, and that's driven in part by the social status benefits of seeming always busy, especially in North American cultural context. So one of my colleagues ran this very clever study where she looked at the extent to which people conferred high status to people who seemed like they never had a spare moment. In these data, she found that in the US, people who never seemed like they had a spare moment were given higher social status, but that this effect didn't hold in Italy, where leisure was seen as higher status than being constantly busy and running from meeting to meeting. So in Europe and other contexts with less of a work central norm, we celebrate leisure and having a lot of time off as being a signal of success. So we have to recognize this in our own selves and also on our teams. And also there's psychology showing that we are medium maximizers. So money is easy to maximize on because we can all think of what the value of a marginal dollar is, but it's very difficult to understand what is the value of an additional 20 minutes a week from now. So we like to kind of put meetings in our schedules or try to go for that next promotion because that's a really concrete and tangible goal, whereas having more free time or feeling more time affluent might be more of an abstract goal. Just kind of recognizing these barriers among within yourself is a good place to start to sort of understand all of our behaviors and what are the factors shaping them. The second time trap that can make us feel time poor is idleness aversion. Again, there's been some clever studies done in this topic. So one of my colleagues asked college students whether they'd rather be left alone in a room with only their thoughts or blast themselves with mild electric shocks. Unsurprisingly, students would rather be blasting themselves with mild electric shocks to be left alone in a room with only their thoughts, attesting to the fact that we generally have an aversion to idleness. So just looking at your own behavior and seeing when you're putting things in your calendar because you're not sure what else you should be doing or because it feels like the right thing to do is a good behavior to kind of ask yourself, am I doing this just to stay busy or appear busy, or do I really need to say yes to this activity? Another trap that can make us time poor is this mere urgency effect. So especially when we're feeling busy, we're more likely to gravitate toward tasks that feel like we're accomplishing something but are getting in the way of our personally important or professional goals. So a very concrete example, this explains why our inboxes go to zero when we're working under a really important deadline. We like to get to the bottom of our inbox because every email that we answer gives us this boost of confidence and self-efficacy. It makes us feel in control of our time in the moment. Of course, it might be coming at the cost of actually working on the writing deadline that we have due. So just recognizing when you're falling into this mere urgency trap is also really important. And of course, I've already talked about technology, but technology can distract and disrupt both our work time and our leisure time. So trying to set really clear boundaries about how we use technology is a key to becoming more time affluent. So these are just a couple of the time traps that I focus on. In the chat window, if you could put kind of what time traps you think that you find yourself falling into the most. I know for me, mere urgency is something that I'm constantly guilty of. Especially when I'm feeling overwhelmed with the big tasks, I will focus on things like scheduling student meetings or answering all the emails in my inbox. So if anyone wants to admit to what time trap they fall into most or suggest any others, that would be great. Yeah, I think the mere urgency effect and the administrative tasks taking those on and technology, I really do feel like these cover a lot of all of our time poverty traps, definitely. And they are related, of course, too. So now I want to talk about some strategies based on my research to help us take more control over our time. So the first strategy I'm going to share based on my research is to cultivate a time first mindset. So again, I mentioned it's kind of easy to go about life trying to maximize money or productivity, number of journal articles, things that are easily trackable. It's a little bit harder to go through life trying to maximize pleasant or positive experiences just because those goals are a little bit more abstract and less concrete. In my, sorry. In my data, I found quite a bit of evidence that people who are able to cultivate a time first mindset do report greater overall life satisfaction and experience greater positive mood and less negative mood on an everyday basis. So in some of my studies, quite a few actually at this point, I've asked people a simple question. I've asked this question many different ways and to many different groups. This is just one example of the way that I've asked this question. Tina values her time more than her money. She's willing to sacrifice money to have more time. Maggie values money more than time. She's willing to sacrifice time to have more money. I find consistent evidence in my data that people who say they're willing to prioritize time more than money report greater life satisfaction. And that's not driven by obvious things like how much money you have or how old you are. We do see as you age, you tend to prioritize time more than money. I also see some evidence for why prioritizing time in the context of life predicts greater overall life satisfaction. In one study, I found that people who had this broad orientation to put time first spent significantly more time socializing, both with close ties, but also people they had never met before when given the opportunity in everyday life. So in one study, I asked college students whether they prioritize time or money 3 months prior to coming into the lab. And I invited them into the lab for a quick get to know you exercise. I found that students who prioritize time said they spent 18% more time socializing, or I watched them spend 18% more time socializing with a peer that they had never met before. And this held controlling for personality factors like extroversion. And it wasn't that people who valued time or money differed in how socially skilled they were. The interactions that my confederates had with them were equally as enjoyable. It's just that when we're focused more on time, we're able to capitalize on the social interaction opportunities in our own life. Of course, this could have possible benefits for firms as well. There's some data that suggests that the number of interactions that you have on an everyday basis predicts outcomes like creative output, but also right now, especially in the COVID environment where it's very easy to go from meeting to meeting to meeting and feel like all of our social interactions are quite instrumental. These weak tie interactions, the casual conversations between meetings are going missing, but are a really critical, important driver of happiness and belonging right now, especially in the hybrid environment. The second strategy that my research suggests is important for cultivating time affluence and greater well-being is this idea of finding time. So just as if we were trying to become more financially secure, more financially wealthy, we would do an audit to see both where we could be making more money, but also where we could be spending less money. When we're trying to think about becoming more time affluent, it's really important to do a time audit and understand how we're spending time on an everyday basis. So in my research and others in the field, we've asked people to go back over the course of a regular work day. Tuesday or Thursday tends to be pretty good because that's a pretty average day. And think about the activities that you spend in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. Write down the major activities that you've done over the course of the day, and then bucket them into whether they were meaningful or productive and put you in a pleasant mood versus made you feel stressed out. So we want to be trying to add experiences into our life that feel meaningful and productive. And perhaps they put us in a positive mood in the moment. So maybe working on your favorite work task will be both productive and positive, but sometimes long-term goals don't feel so pleasant in the moment, but they're helping you work towards important goals in your life. So training for a marathon, not every run is going to feel great, but that activity is helping you accomplish goals that you find meaningful in the context of your life. So that's top left-hand quadrant. And we all need to make time to sit on our couch and hang out with friends and family and not necessarily do anything that's quote unquote meaningful or productive. So we need some activities in the bottom right-hand quadrant too. However, we need to be really mindful about activities that fall in the bottom left-hand quadrant. So those are activities that put us in a negative mood and are not productive. Maybe that's administrative work. in the context of our jobs. Maybe that's house cleaning or other tasks. And then we should ask ourselves, is there anything I can do to buy myself out of those experiences? Or delegate tasks or say no. So we want to be really thinking about what labor economists call maximizing your U index, or what my colleagues and I joke is the Marie Kondo method of time, which is backed by economics research, is that we should be maximizing the amount of time that we spend in meaningful and positive activities and minimizing the amount of time that we spend in unpleasant and negative activities that interfere with other goals that we might have in life. So we really want to be thinking about that bottom left-hand quadrant and ask ourselves, is there ways to minimize, say no, delegate, or outsource any of the activities that fall in that bucket that might not be a source of meaning or positivity? It's also worth bringing back this idea of the mere urgency effect. Again, we're especially likely to do those kinds of activities when we're feeling busy and stressed out, because it gives us a little bit of feeling of control over the stress that we're experiencing, but obviously it's going to come in the way of our major goals professionally and personally. So how can we concretely find time? So one of the research-backed strategies that my students and I have uncovered is pretty straightforward, but it's putting proactive blocks of time in your calendar. And so we ran an experiment with busy executives who work in client-facing roles, and we asked them to book time or proactive time into their calendar as much as they could. So this was one person who did it every day. These are the green blocks in the calendar. And we asked people to schedule these meetings and to not check email during them, and to work on things that they wanted to do or needed to do for work, but were not necessarily urgent. So they were important things, but they weren't urgent things. We also told the executives to tell their teams that they were going to be scheduling proactive time on their calendars, so that their team members weren't surprised if for a couple of hours every day, people, their managers went missing from email communication. So this was coordinated at the team level, and I think that's really important from an implementation standpoint. We also asked people to schedule a 30-minute planning block with themselves. So they spent 30 minutes where they wrote down what they were going to do with these blocks of time that they found themselves with throughout the week. And in these data, we saw that after 6 weeks of scheduling uninterrupted time for important but not urgent tasks, employees reported being 14% more efficient. They also reported significantly lower levels of burnout. I sometimes get the question of when should I schedule these blocks? Data suggests that we actually want to be working on our hardest task first. So most people believe that putting a few light tasks before you work on your personally important tasks or your professionally important tasks is helpful strategy for increasing efficacy at work and productivity. But research suggests that's actually not true. So if we put our easiest tasks first, then we get distracted from our more major tasks, we spend less time on it, and we have less cognitive bandwidth for it. So the best empirical evidence suggests to put these blocks in the beginning of the day and to work on your most important stuff at the beginning of the day. Another strategy that I like to talk about as related to my research is related to the idea of negotiating for more time. So I've published a couple of papers over the last 2 years looking at the benefits of negotiating for time on adjustable deadlines at work. So it is interesting to note that among knowledge workers, about half of our deadlines at work are adjustable, in part because we use deadlines, the commitment device. So we actually put meetings or deadlines into our calendar as an encouragement to get work done, which behavioral science says is great. So it's good to put these commitment devices into our calendars to get our work done. However, these deadlines can be a source of stress, particularly when they're adjustable. So in our data, about 50% of people said they had adjustable deadlines at work, but fewer than 10% said they would ask for more time on adjustable deadlines when they were prompted. And this is despite the fact that getting more time to work on tasks increases performance. So it's important for managers and teams to have really clear conversations about what matters. So we see in our data that employees believe that their managers will care about speed when they're working under a deadline, even if it's adjustable, whereas managers care more about quality. So trying to have conversations where you're very clear about when you're maximizing quality versus speed and when asking for more time is okay seems to be really important for stress reduction, burnout reduction, but also for improving the quality of work. It's also worth noting that in our data, we see that junior employees and women are especially unlikely to ask for more time on adjustable deadlines because they're worried about burdening others. And so especially for employees who belong to these groups, it's important to have explicit conversations about when deadlines are adjustable and when they aren't. Another question in the chat window, so have you found that there is an ideal amount of proactive time to incorporate into each day, or is it pretty flexible? That's a really interesting question. So I haven't seen any data, we don't have any data kind of showing optimal amounts of time. In general, in my research, it's interesting because I focus on like the subjective impression of time and how people feel about the time that they have. And I see that matters a lot more for happiness than objectively how much time you spend allocated to different activities. So for an example, there's some research, not mine, showing that people gain greater happiness in life when their actual time use maps onto how they would ideally like to spend their time. So to try to figure out how much proactive time you should put in your calendar, you should kind of ask yourself what your ideal calendar would look like, how much time you would ideally have to work on professionally important tasks during the workday, and then how much time you actually spend on those tasks each week, kind of looking at whatever calendar you typically use for work, and then ask yourself where there's discrepancies and try to rectify those discrepancies. Rachel, I saw that you also had your hand up.
I asked her to write it on the chat. There it is.
No problem at all. So yeah, in general, we want to be thinking about trying to cultivate more time for ourselves in a way that's consistent with our ideal time use, and not worry so much about the specific amount of time we're spending across different activities, because that will vary depending on what you value, what you care about, what your goals are. There's also research suggesting that when we overschedule our calendars, this can also feel very stressful. So in general, there's some research in marketing showing that when you schedule meetings at work back to back to back, that this can actually be quite stressful because it seems efficient at the time, but you actually are pulled out of the present moment and you're then thinking about the upcoming meeting while you're in a meeting. And that can undermine your enjoyment, your memory of the meeting that you're currently in. So it's actually better to leave a little bit of break in between these different different meetings in your day. Scheduling your time too close to the clock for leisure activities can also undermine satisfaction. So the same research team randomly kind of asked people to schedule their leisure sort of like further apart or closer together. And they found when people are scheduling different leisure activities closer together, like I'm going to go to the gym and then see my friend and then watch some TV and then make cookies, that when you put leisure activities into your calendar and you schedule them back to back to back, they start to feel more like work and you enjoy them less, again, because you're sort of pulled out of the present and thinking about the next activity. So in general, when we're thinking about scheduling our time, we want to leave ourselves some slack in between meetings. Easier said than done as a time management person who doesn't do this very often or well, and also to try to not schedule our leisure too much. The third strategy that my research suggests can help us take control of our time and live a happier life is funding time. So again, we want to be thinking about removing activities that fall into that bottom left-hand quadrant that make us unhappy, that are stressful. One way of doing that is to outsource our tasks to others or to spend money to save time. So I've done quite a bit of research on this over the last few years as part of my dissertation and then a couple of projects since. First, we just started asking people whether they spent any money to outsource disliked tasks, and whether if people did, they reported greater overall life satisfaction, less stress, and greater happiness. Consistent with our predictions and consistent with the idea we want to be thinking about maximizing the amount of time we spend in positive activities and minimizing the negative. We saw that people who spent more time or spent some money, at least in a typical month, outsourcing tasks to others or spending money on time-saving services reported greater happiness and less stress. In some follow-up data, we see that people who spend money to save time are happier on the days that they do this, in part because they spend more time socializing. So going back to something that I had mentioned earlier in the talk, but also they enjoy their social interactions more. So when you're not thinking about all the other things you have to do once you're done having lunch or going for a walk with a friend, you can actually enjoy that leisure experience to a greater extent. So there seems to be some happiness benefits of these purchases driven by simply not feeling worried about all the other things you have to do when you get home from the leisure experience. It's worth mentioning that I also have some data on couples showing that couples who spend money to save time when they make this decision together report greater relationship satisfaction, in part because they're able to spend more quality time together. So when they are together, they're able to enjoy each other's company as opposed to trying to kind of juggle all of the demands that they might have. So that does seem to be one positive related to time-saving purchases as well. I also have data suggesting you don't need very much money, and a little bit can go a long way. So even spending $40 in a way to save time, when we randomly assign people to do that as compared to spending on a material purchase for themselves, this resulted in greater end of day happiness, less stress. And again, the happiness benefits were driven in part because people were substituting the time that they weren't picking up groceries to spend quality time with loved ones. The last strategy that's based on research that I'm going to talk about today is just this idea of reframing time. There's going to be some activities we can't outsource, we can't delegate, we need to do them for work or in our personal lives for whatever reason. And so for these activities, we want to be thinking about reframing time. One of my PhD students, former PhD students, did a research project where she found that for some of these tasks that might be onerous and tiring, maybe for myself, cleaning a data set so that one of my colleagues can analyze it. If we reframe that activity as helping our colleague get their work done, we can experience greater satisfaction from that activity and we're less stressed by it. Similarly, some of my colleagues have some data for a paper that I really like, showing that reframing our leisure can also have positive benefits for happiness and reductions of stress as well. So they randomly assigned busy working adults to one of two conditions. In one condition, they asked these busy working adults to treat their weekend like a vacation. In the other condition, they asked people to treat their upcoming weekend like a weekend. They found that people who thought about their upcoming weekend like a vacation reported significantly greater happiness benefits as a result of that vacation, in part because they were less stressed and were more present in the moment. You might just be thinking that these findings are driven by the fact that the vacation people spent more money or gave up on their chores for that weekend, but that's not the case. So there was no difference in the amount that people spent across conditions. And there was also no difference in the extent to which people completed chores. It's just that this prompt helped people be more present in the moment and try to prioritize positivity. So they're really trying to capitalize on their leisure experiences during the weekend. I've been doing a large project with a management consulting firm, and we hear this strategy come up spontaneously, especially when people are like we are now, confined to our house more than maybe we would like, where busy management consultants would travel the world with their kids on the weekend by buying fancy cheese, for example, and pretending that they were in France for the weekend with their family. So there's a lot of fun things you can do around the house to really try to maximize the benefit of the time off that you have away from work. Now, there are some strategies that have emerged out of the COVID-19 pandemic that I think are especially important to keep in mind related to the points I was making at the beginning of the talk about digital distraction. So we've seen in the data that the work days are longer, we're spending more time on email and in meetings, back-to-back Zoom calls. And so it's especially important, given that the commute used to provide a separation between work and home, to build in breaks, boundaries, and transitions into our virtual workday. So one strategy we can all take to try to create clear demarcation between the beginning and the end of the day is to create a virtual commute. Microsoft recently implemented this strategy among their knowledge workers, where they didn't allow their teams to put meetings on their calendar from 8 to 9 a.m. Why? Well, because they didn't want people to work when they would have otherwise been commuting to the office, and were encouraging their teams instead to exercise or spend time with friends and family. Similarly, you want to set goals for yourself at the end of the day, or give yourself an end of day ritual. Maybe this is cooking dinner with your family, or a virtual exercise class, or a walk around the block, something that's going to clearly signal that it's the end of the workday and help you disconnect. I've also suggested strategies for the weekend, like close the door in your home office and don't go in there on the weekend, or have a separate phone for work and personal, anything that can create mental separation between work and personal when you're working and living in the same physical space is really important. As we've already talked about, putting proactive time in your calendar is important. And another strategy that I think is really interesting is this idea of creating a time map once to-do list. So this is a set of activities that you can put on your office computer of things that are non-work related that you could do with 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. So often we find ourselves with small pockets of time throughout the day. Maybe a meeting gets canceled, maybe something takes longer or shorter rather than you were expecting, and you find yourself with 15 minutes in between meetings. It's not enough time to start a full another set of projects or your next important task. Maybe we just fill that time typically, at least in my personal experience, with email. So can you challenge yourself to fill that time with non-work related activities instead? Maybe this looks like 10 jumping jacks. Maybe this looks like chatting with your partner or going for a quick walk around the block. Anything that you can do to kind of imbue your work day with some of these leisure activities so that we're not just waiting for a moment in which we have 3 or 4 hours off on the weekend to get all of our personal stuff done, can be really helpful for mitigating stress and increasing happiness. So I've talked about a few strategies related to building in breaks, rituals. So that's the kind of creating a virtual commute and an end of day ritual, recognizing the mere urgency effect. So when are you working on things that are urgent but not important because you really need to actually get something done on a major deadline? And I want everyone in the chat window to commit to one strategy they'll use tomorrow or this week to change how you spend your time or think about your time. Yeah, so I'd like everyone just in the chat window right now to identify one element you think you'll commit to changing. Doesn't have to be the strategies we talked about, but could just be something that this talk reminded you of that you should do better, do differently. For the people who are saying rituals, does anyone have anything in mind in particular? So I like to go on my exercise bike in the morning and drink some coffee and feed my kid before the workday starts. But I'm curious if anyone has any specific ritual examples. Orange Theory, awesome, love that. One other thing I will say just to end before kind of going into questions is that it's really important to do this at the team level. So much of our work is interconnected. And so all of the strategies I talked about in the book and study in general are focused at the level of the individual, because it's, I'm a micro-organizational psychologist, so I usually focus on what people are doing. But I started a research project looking at how to set these norms on teams. So if you really want to accomplish all of these personal goals, but you work on highly interdependent teams, it's really important to coordinate your time together. So can you encourage yourself to all take a break from 12 to 1 or schedule a virtual commute for your entire team from 8 to 9? In the absence of having these explicit conversations, people do believe, because of these ideal worker norms in our work culture, that they have to be available all the time. So they might not take breaks or have boundaries at the beginning and the end of the day, as we're suggesting, not because it wouldn't benefit them, but because they think they need to be constantly available just in case. So one thing I've been advocating for quite a bit in my recent work is having these conversations at the team level. So what are things that you and your team can do to make sure everyone's finding time, not only to excel at work, but they need to get done in their personal lives, without trying to do all of their personal stuff and other things that matter to them in the spare moments in the middle of the day or very early in the morning or late at night. All of, kind of the underlying research and more detail about all of the studies can be found in an HBR article that I wrote called Time for Happiness. And also the book that I think a few of you will be, that will be raffled kind of like at the end of this talk. And I do want to just underscore that I'm an academic. So my suggestions are based on academic research. I know some of them might seem intuitive, but I think what's important is to actually hold ourselves accountable to following through on some of the things that we know are good for us from a happiness perspective, but might be difficult to put into practice. All right, so I'm excited to answer some questions here. Yakil's asking, do you have any recommendations of how to make this work for those who are parenting of young kids or have 24/7 caring responsibilities? So obviously we all have different constraints on our time. So I think, I'm just recently became a parent myself. So I understand, the actual, I'm living my research. Time poverty exists. I'm being constantly distracted and disrupted all day, every day. And especially these time poverty feelings are going to be higher if you have caregiving responsibilities as well. I think there's a couple of different things that become really important when your schedule becomes very challenging for personal and professional reasons. One, setting very clear boundaries, I think, between work and home, being very forgiving of yourself, I think, and being compassionate that it's very stressful and busy time goes a long way to reducing stress associated with being busy due to external demands. I think outsourcing, asking for help are really underutilized strategies, as well as saying no. We want to please everyone around us, and it's not a bad thing. But my research suggests as long as you frame why you're saying no for a reason that's not related to time. So you don't want to say, no, I can't do something because I don't have time, but rather, no, I can't do something, or no, I can't do something because of a personal obligation, that those kinds of excuses are more well received, not excuses, but reasons are more well received. And so this is where, again, I think having like very clear conversations with your team become really important. And I think asking for help, asking for advice, spending money to outsource, things that you can do to make your job and life more manageable on an everyday basis, as well as negotiating with your partner around caregiving responsibilities and setting norms around work and life separation while working from home for both of you is really important. So again, most of my early research on this topic is really focused at the level of the individual, but obviously we work on teams and many of us have partners. So I think having very clear conversations and about time and expectations at both of those levels are critical here too. So the next comment is I've become very conscious of time lately, given that I'm trying to make time to speak to my family. We're separated by five-hour time difference. Do you have any advice for people in my position who all have almost time barriers to their leisure time? That's really interesting. So I would say that becomes really important to schedule time in your calendar for leisure and treat it as important as work. So when you're trying to connect with loved ones who live in different time zones, I myself have this situation, the best time to chat might be in the middle of a work day. And I think this is where you can apply the proactive time blocking to personally important activities too. We tend to overestimate the negative effects of asking for more time or discussing our boundaries with others in the workplace. People tend to be very understanding and more understanding than we would expect. So this is again where I think being honest with your team when authentic, saying that you have a personal obligation during a time that would then allow you to chat when everyone's energy is high in your family is important and helpful to the extent that you can do it. Yeah, so I think the email question is really hard. Ben, I know that I have created a lot of stress on my academic teams when I used to travel a lot, or when I'm working late because that's the only time I can work, because that's just when it's convenient for me given other demands, and then sending an email at the time I was working. So I think it would all go a long way in academia if we delayed sent like our emails to normal office hours, or explicitly say that I'm working on this email because this is a time that is good for me, but I do not expect and do not want an instantaneous response. Because I can say that I've seen countless times where I've sent an email in the middle of the night, which was morning for me, and it caused panic on my teams that created stress that wasn't necessary. So I think limiting or having very clear norms around email conversation outside of normal hours is really important. One thing we've done with our management consulting teams is to have explicit conversations that if an email is happening before 8 or after 8, they work 12-hour days, whatever the kind of end time makes sense for whatever the industry, that I will not email you, I will call you only if it's urgent. So then people don't expect that they need to be on their email at all times. I think we could stand to have more of those norms in academia too, given that I know we all create a lot of stress for each other by emailing at all times of the day and night. It seems that people have received the book, so that's great. I'm also happy to take any additional questions and or provide people with a little bit of a windfall of time. I want to make sure that all the questions have been answered though first. I also want to say that I have, as a time researcher, the demanding job, I have successfully asked for more time on an adjustable deadline at work related to my third year review, and I highly recommend that academics do this. Like, I asked first, and based on like a couple papers or whatever I was working on, it was no problem. They weren't going to meet for 6 months later or something. And similarly, when working on papers now, I'm trying to get journal data to see who asks for more time and does it improve the quality of work. But my data with college students suggests asking for more time does improve the quality of work. And so I think pushing back on really tight deadlines at journals is also one possible strategy for academics that I'm trying to get empirical data on right now.
And I just really quickly want to hop in, just in case people missed the chat. Our 5 book winners are Jan Schumann, Felicia Desir, Eva Martinos, Ren Garcia, who's a member of Women in Science, and Xiao Ying Wei. So if you guys can either copy my email down, it's in the Zoom chat, or DM me your email, and I'll be in touch of how to get the book to you. That'll be great.
And Chris, this is such an important point, that there's little mental bandwidth to plan or implement these strategies. So should burnout be addressed first before implementing these strategies? It is a bit of a chicken and egg, so you do need a little bit of time to try to figure out what strategy you might want to implement. But I think what I document in my research, at least, is trying to put time first, even just shifting the mindset of really trying to prioritize time in one's personal life, and then making 1 or 2 decisions related to that priority can have really important effects on happiness across time. And so even as we just become more aware of, like, even something subtle, like, do we keep our phone by our bed? And then so when we kind of are tossing and turning at night, we email. Like, is there something small like this that we can notice, recognize we don't need to do, and then try to stop doing? It's not going to solve burnout. So I'm definitely not saying that the things that that's going to take organizational, societal, and individual change. It's going to take cultural change, and it takes more time to implement. But starting today, right now, I think trying to think about how might you spend 10 minutes differently, $40 differently, in light of the research findings that I have, is a helpful place to start, to try to make small changes that we can control, at least, even to improve happiness and reduce stress. And even having conversations about these issues on our teams with the folks that we work with can also be really helpful to start normalizing conversations about personal time. And then when managing research assistants and other staff and monitoring time for accountability, what are best practices for ensuring this is not onerous or make people feel more stressed out? There is a lot of research showing that billing by the hour can make people feel really conscious of how they're spending time. So Sanford DeVoe and Jeff Pfeiffer have a lot of great research showing that when we bill by the hour, we think about every hour not being productive as lost. I also have some data showing that people who are paid under performance incentives spend more time socializing with colleagues and less time socializing with friends and family because they see their colleagues as instrumental for getting ahead. And then they have some data showing that people who are paid by the hour, regardless of how much money they make, both don't take as much paid leisure and then also don't enjoy it to the same extent. So I think the recommendation following from some of the academic literature here is kind of like the findings related to not scheduling too much leisure. I think not making billing so salient. So you do need to have accountability, but it shouldn't be the extent to which we've heard lawyers say that they, are clicking a counter every 30 minutes. So it's trying to do it at the end of the day or at the end of the week and not make this billing so salient could help kind of offset some of the stress associated with billing practices. And then, do you find a difference in time mindset between corporate America and academic professionals? I haven't actually looked at at this difference, I think, I mean, I work with management consulting firms and with obviously a lot of academics since I am one. I think that there's actually a lot of similarity in terms of the always on culture and, you know, the ability to work wherever and however, which comes at the cost of having to be available all the time. So I see a lot of similarities now that I've, like, you know, been an academic and been working with management consulting firms for the last couple of years about these kinds of feelings of the ideal worker is someone who's constantly working, these norms around constant communication being a signal of commitment. And so I think both settings have challenges in terms of time management and boundary setting. And then, you know, of course, there's maybe less of a necessarily a profit focus. It's more like a publication focus of productivity in academic settings. But I think both realms have quantifiable metrics, like amount of revenue, number of publications, that make, I think, the psychology and some of the time management effects, or the time management challenges rather, quite similar in my experience. Yeah, exactly. And then 4-day work weeks. So I do have an HBR looking at the benefit of 4-day work weeks with one of my colleagues, Charlotte Lockhart. There hasn't been a lot of good experimental evidence. So the data is a little bit based on who opts in, like self-selection and correlational and suggestive evidence that 4-day work weeks reduce stress and improve happiness, reduce burnout. There's also been some unsuccessful case studies because the culture didn't change, right? So sure, we can implement a 4-day work week, but I'm just going to work on that 5th day anyways because everyone else is. And so this really does speak to the importance of norms around time needing to change, and a lot of the conversation around time affluence needing to be something that's being driven by the top, in addition to being experimented with by all levels of an organization. But it does need to be something that there's clear norms and clear policies put into place. We do have some data even on the deadline extension request projects that putting clear policies into place that say you can ask for an extension, and putting that in the syllabus and then reiterating it for college students helped women feel more comfortable asking for more time. So I think this is where it becomes really important for the organizational culture, organizational culture plays a really important role in whether people are going to benefit or actually use 4-day work weeks or reduced work week schedules. But I think it's really interesting. It's come up a lot in popular debate right now. And I think it's a good idea to the extent that you can get everyone to do it. Otherwise, it's creating inequalities between people who opt in and people who don't.
Great. Well, we are just about at time, and I would hate for this event specifically to be the one that goes over time. So thank you so much, Ashley, for coming and talking to us, and thank you for meeting with me and signing those books on a random evening. So yeah, just a reminder again, if everyone who is selected can reach out to me, or just make sure they have my contact down. And I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day, and thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great conversation. I hope everyone has a great rest of their week and a leisurely weekend. Right?